Thank you all for coming out tonight. My name's Jenny, and I'm on the events team here at Books Are Magic. Before we get started, I wanted to point out just a couple logistics for how tonight's going to go. First off, we encourage, but don't require you to keep your mask on at all times while at this event. We'll be doing an audience hand-raised Q&A towards the end, so start thinking of questions to ask now and raise your hand when the time comes. Jessica will repeat your question into their mic to ensure that viewers on the live stream can hear as well. And after the talk tonight, Sara will be signing and personalizing books at that alcove right next to the register at the front of the store. And if you're joining us virtually on our YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of Momfluenced online using the link in the live stream description. All right, so tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Sara Petersen and Jessica Grose, who are here to discuss Sara's debut book, Momfluenced. In Momfluenced, Petersen investigates mom influencers, mothers who turn their private work into public performance on social media, generating billions of dollars on the message that motherhood is a beautiful experience. Momfluencers churn out daily content that is wholly dependent on their lives and roles as mothers. Drawing on her own fraught relationship to momfluencer culture, Sara incorporates pop culture analysis and interviews with prominent momfluencers and experts to explore the glorification of the ideal mother online with both humor and empathy. Momfluenced argues that momfluencers don't simply sell mothers on the benefits of bamboo diapers. They also sell us on the dream of motherhood itself, a dream tangled up in whiteness, capitalism, and the heteronormative nuclear family. Sara has written about motherhood and feminism for the New York Times, Harper's Bazaar, the Washington Post, and elsewhere, and she also writes the newsletter In Pursuit of Clean Countertops, where she explores the cult of ideal motherhood. And as I mentioned a moment ago, Jessica is here to discuss Momfluenced with Sara. Jessica is an opinion writer at the New York Times, and she's also the author of Screaming on the Inside as well. Glamour called her a game changer in 2020 for her coverage of parenting during the pandemic. So without further delay, everyone please give a very warm welcome to Sara and Jessica.
Thank you all so much for coming. We are going to start with Sara doing a little bit of reading.
Many people have asked me why this book is focused on momfluencer culture and not influencer culture in general. And while my reasons are plentiful, the primary answer is that motherhood renders all mothers powerless to an extent. And momfluencer culture offers us power and control. We cannot control our bodies during pregnancy. We cannot control who our children will be. We cannot control who we will turn out to be as mothers. I harbored grand fantasies of being a serene earth goddess mother before having kids, the type who would think about traveling across time zones with her baby as an adventure rather than a logistical, sleep-deprived nightmare. We cannot control how motherhood will make us feel. I am continuously shaken by the nuance of feeling that motherhood ushers in. How I feel when my 6-year-old daughter tells me she doesn't want me to put her hair in a bun because it isn't, quote, pretty enough. How I feel when I don't get an invite to a mom hang. How I feel when my first baby tells me how big a whale's brain is. Motherhood can hurt us just as deeply as it can bring us joy. It is a role defined by vulnerability. And momfluencer culture is defined by trusting ourselves and others to respect that vulnerability. As we'll see throughout this book, this trust can be beautiful. And as we'll explore in chapter 6, this trust can also be dangerous. Power and trust can always be used for good and evil. Ultimately, momfluencer culture allows us to control, at least to an extent, the mythology of our own motherhood. I don't have a ton of followers on Instagram, but every mom-centric photograph or caption I post is chosen to communicate something specific about my motherhood, about the type of mom I want others to see when they look at me. I want people to know I have a sense of humor and I'm not precious, so I post a photo of some dumb kid selfies with quippy, dry captions. Or maybe a Snickers wrapper found nestled between cushions. I want people to know I'm thoughtful, that I value the beautiful, liminal moments of motherhood, so I post a photo of sea-sprayed baby curls. I want people to appreciate my personal style, so I post a photo of the baby in a onesie dappled with indigo-colored block prints of seaweed made, obviously, by a little-known Brooklyn-based company. The photo is well lit, the composition is good. I want people to know I'm smart and care about things bigger than myself, So I post about motherhood literature and maternal advocacy. I want people to know I'm a cool mom, sometimes even a hot mom. So I post a photo of myself in a hand-knit ochre sweater, my love for ochre will never die, and jeans that make my ass look perky. In the photo I'm wearing makeup, but it's meant to look like I'm too cool to care about makeup or how I look. I want people to know I am loved, and therefore I must, to some extent, be a decent mom. So I post a photo of smiling kids snuggled in my lap. A couple thousand people digest my mythology, and who's to say it doesn't impact how they think of their own motherhood mythologies? I am a mother on Instagram, and what I choose to show influences those who watch. I am a momfluencer. If you are a mother on Instagram, so are you.
Are we momfluencing right now?
We
Like
totally
live?
IRL.
Well, so tell me about the genesis of this book. What made you decide to go deep on something that I think many of us observe, even if we are not parents? I thought it was really interesting that you talked to a lot of women who were fascinated by the momfluencer world and yet were not parents and didn't plan to become anytime soon. So tell me about the decision to do a book-length project on this.
Yeah, so we were talking earlier about how when we had our first kids, this wasn't a thing. I had my first kid in 2012, and I didn't discover like mommy blogs until like 2014, 15. And I just became super fascinated by how joyful, how free, how colorful, how like adventurous their portrayals of motherhood were, especially in comparison to my motherhood, which at the time I had a toddler and a newborn, and I was like, going to music together classes and, doing story time and was often profoundly bored. And it did not feel like this identity that completely fulfilled me or made me into like the heroine of my own story in the way that these mommy bloggers, they seem to have found like the secret sauce. So yeah, that's where my sort of fascination stemmed from. And then I ended up writing a piece for Harper's Bazaar, and the first draft was like 20 pages long. And that's when I like knew, I just saw so many intersecting themes. And I just knew it was worth like a full book length exploration.
And what surprised, as you were doing the exploration, it sounds like you had been immersed sort of in the culture for quite a while. Was there anything in particular that surprised you about what you learned? Did you gain new respect or, disdain for the people who are, doing this professionally and not just amateurs like us?
Yeah, I mean, I think I naively thought that everyone was kind of coming in like me, wanting to inhabit a very particular ideal. And that wasn't at all the case. I talked to, I don't know, probably close to 100 people for this book, and everybody kind of went in with their own momfluencer kryptonite. And I think often it reflected a place within themselves that they felt insecure or they felt was lacking, where they saw a momfluencer maybe succeeding or perceived them to be succeeding in some way that they were not. So that was really interesting. And I also think like researching the book really clarified that my ideal mother that's living in my head is not everybody's ideal mother. There is no ideal mother archetype. I think that was the biggest takeaway, which was really freeing in a way.
Why do you think, and I've tried to explore this, I think sometimes more successfully than others, because I think I have my own blind spots around perfectionism because I am a perfectionist. But I think that there's something when you become a mother that any sort of instinct towards that, and again, however you interpret it, is ignited.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you think that that's correct. And I'm also wondering why you think it. I mean, my explanation for it is just because the stakes feel very high.
Yeah.
Because you have a kid and you love them so much and you don't want to fuck them up.
Right.
So that's the root of it for me. But I'm wondering, did you see that as you were exploring this? Do you think that there are other roots for, and I don't think it's universal, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
that's like, when you start doing reporting on among parents, you just realize there's so many stories and so many, everyone has their sort of individual take. But I was wondering if, what about it leads towards this perfectionism?
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. And I think the other thing that leads us to think there is some sort of perfect way to do motherhood is that, I mean, structurally, we're completely, unsupported in this country. And because of that, there is this assumption that we just have all the tools we need within us. And if it doesn't feel natural or if it doesn't feel joyful or easy, then there's a deficit within us, not the systems surrounding us. And I do think in some ways momfluencer culture preys on those insecurities because we can find a momfluencer for anything. We can find a momfluencer who teaches us the best way to sleep train, the best way to feed, the best way to clothe our children in, undyed, whatever. And so because of the proliferation of best ways, I do think that feeds into this very vulnerable, very high stakes. We get this one chance with this like very raw material, and none of us want to fuck it up.
Two questions. One, did you look at any international influencers? There's one that I have a lot. She's fallen off for me, but she's Swedish and she has 10 children, and her handle is something like My Baby Dolls. And it's more like, it's not a aspirational relationship that I have with her. It's a more
like a shock and awe.
Pure, it's like, what's happening? Like, and like, God bless her. I'm sure she's like a great person. Like, but it's I'm just like, what's happening? Like, there's just so many children. But did you go into sort of international waters for this? Because I think there is something unique to American motherhood, and that's why I focused on it for my book, because exactly as you say, there is sort of a lack of social support.
Right.
So did you sort of look at any
I
non-American?
Not explicitly, though there are a handful of UK influencers living in like, grand manor houses that are really fascinating to me. Like rehab chateaus in France. And they like dress to match the time period from the houses. So, I am fascinated by them, but I didn't like explicitly research any international like differences.
What I liked was you talked about sort of the different varietals, and I almost pictured that cafeteria scene in Mean Girls where they're going to the different tables and saying like, here's the weird art kids. Tell us a little bit more about the sort of, trad wives and the,
Totally.
groupings, which I don't think we could be here all night if you wanted to do an exhaustive grouping, but I'd love to hear sort of the ones you focused on.
Totally. I feel like the one that, I don't know, maybe comes quickly to people's mind is like, I don't know, the Nantucket mansion, the blonde beachy waves, all white, all beige everything, no clutter. And that one never really spoke to me, only because like the glossiness, like it felt, there was nothing that I could like latch onto. Like I can never attain glossy. I can never attain uncluttered. So I don't know, which I think is also interesting and says something about like who we do latch onto. I think, at least for myself, I tend to become obsessed with the ones where I feel like if I just tweak X, Y, and Z, I could maybe attain that. Whereas like the super glossy perfect ones I never could, so they never really like held much emotional weight. But so there's that one, the beachy waved, like perfect, white, then, heteronormative, cishet. And then, the trad momfluencers are fascinating because there's the trad momfluencers who, make their own clothes, they live in a farm, there's no plastic in sight, and it feels very aesthetically rooted in the past. But there's also the trad momfluencers who, aesthetically are very contemporary, but are posting things about, save the children. There's a big thing about making their husbands sandwiches. I don't know what that is, but it is a thing. And, like, they're very committed to, like, the kids, like, leaving the husband alone when he gets home from work. But, And then there's like the cool moms, like I don't know. I'm trying to think of the other categories. I'm definitely missing some.
To me, it's also about sort of their lane. So there's the ones who focus more on clothes and beauty, and tell us a little bit about the monetizing of this world, because I think that's, to my internal definition of what this means, it's not just someone who has a lot of followers. They have to be selling something,
Right.
whether it's their own, like someone that I had a chapter about, influencers in my book, and someone said, do I actually believe this woman's feeding advice, or is she just moderately attractive? Like they have their, if they have an expertise, they're selling that. Like, talk about the sort of relationship between actually selling us something, whether it's clothing, your plan to feed solids, whatever it is.
The monetization is really interesting because it just varies so widely. A momfluencer can have a deal with Amazon and be making like several thousand per post, or she can be trying to sell her, book about like the dangers of mold and like big sunscreen, which is a whole thing in a very certain subset of momfluencer culture. And not a ton of them make a ton of money, which I think is a big misconception. It's also a ton of work, and it's like constant, all-consuming work that really blurs the line between private and public lives. And I did find a ton of misogyny baked into how we view their labor, which is really skilled labor and has largely taken the place of traditional, women's glossy mags, traditional women's advertising. And these people are like writers, they're photographers, they're editors, they're business people who are negotiating contracts. And I think because they're mothers, their work is, it becomes a pejorative thing, like mommy bloggers. Even that term is really denigrated. And I think people are also really uncomfortable with mothers openly wanting to make money, which is absurd, of course.
Yeah, there's so many statistics about how we're at this really complicated place in terms of how we feel about mothers working outside the house. We think that they should do it, but at the same time, we also think that they should be home full-time with their children. When you look at sort of the polling and statistics, and it's like, you realize there are not enough hours in the day, like you're not two separate people, and there's, I feel like we're in a transitional period, which in some ways is the worst of all possible worlds, because there is, and mothers have always worked. Many mothers have always worked. So, we're talking about the upper middle class who was seen as, not supposed to be, in the, outside the domestic sphere. But there's still this sort of complicated, feeling like, oh, you're lazy if you're not making money outside the home. But at the same time, you should also be with your kids all the time.
Yeah.
And do you feel like the momfluencers are sort of experiencing that conflict and that, push-pull that society feels like they're putting on us in this moment?
Yeah, like, they spent so much time taking photos of the kids, they weren't actually spending time with the kids. And it's like, neither were all the moms, like, working in an office building, but that's somehow okay. I think because there's this perception that they're profiting directly from motherhood, which I would argue they're not. They're profiting from other things. They're profiting from, the cultural expectations and ideals of motherhood, but their actual skill set has nothing to do with the labor of mothering, which is, like, inherently private, inherently specific to your kids and your family.
Mm-hmm.
So I always find that kind of a thorny thing.
So I recently wrote a piece where I talked about the first sort of generation of YouTube parent vloggers, their kids are coming of age. Right. And some of them are trying to pass legislation that allows them to remove themselves from the, these images that they feel they didn't consent to as children. And they're very angry, understandably, that they feel that their childhoods were sold without their consent. Did you find that any of the momfluencers that you spoke to were grappling with these ideas. Did they think about how, if they showed their kids, because many don't show their kids' faces,
Right.
but if they did involve their kids in the production of, influencing, did they think about these topics?
Yeah, I think almost everyone I talked to thought pretty deeply about it. One person I talked to, had really open, direct conversations with her kid, and from, the jump said, if you ever feel uncomfortable, you gotta let me know. And one of them did, and so she just stopped. One of them also set up, like, a college fund, and again was really clear with her kids about, like, this is the money I'm making, and this is where your cut is going. And many of them had really, like, strong opinions about their own children's use of social media, which I thought was really interesting. Like, many of them were hardline, like, not until 18. So yeah, and that's another misconception. I feel like, there's this idea that, even that is, obnoxious, but, like, they're not thinking about it. They don't care about their kids.
Yeah.
They just want to make money off their kids. And I don't know, I just do think a lot of the criticisms are rooted in misogyny.
Yeah. I mean, as
Obviously.
they always are.
Yeah.
It's funny, when I was younger, I sounded younger, and anytime I would appear on the radio, I would get just nasty emails about my voice and how it sounded young, and I was like, yeah, I am young.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to sound like Ted Koppel. What do you want out of my life? And so it's just, I think, many women just existing in the world, trying to speak,
Totally.
show themselves.
Yeah.
If you were going to reform momfluencing, so you do a really great job of sort of pointing out ways in which it is not always a positive force. It's hard to generalize because it's so everywhere. There's so many. They're speaking to different audiences. They're having sort of different effects. But in terms of the things that are not so positive, if you were to change them, what would you change?
Oh, gosh. I mean, it's so hard and so complicated. I guess I always come back to the fact that, I said earlier, there are no maternal ideals, and that's true for individuals, but I do think America has a cultural ideal of who is a good mom and who gets to be a good mom. And I think that ideal is really culturally entrenched and dictates so much, not just momfluencer content, but all of the media we consume, all of the depictions of motherhood. And I guess in terms of reform, it's like a grand wish that, that ideal it doesn't exist anymore, and that, it's not so clearly defined, and that those who fall outside of the ideal are erased or othered. But in terms of, like, practicality, I know some of, I think the Netherlands has, like, laws, in place. So if a kid is participating in the parent's content, he or she has to get a certain cut, and it's very, like, black and white, so it's not on individuals to make those calls. I think that would help.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the legislation here is trying to do. It's trying to be similar to the laws that were in the early days of Hollywood that, set aside a specific amount of money, said, child labor laws, which, you could ostensibly just make your kid pose for pictures for hours and hours a day, and there's no one to stop you. So it's just trying to create some sort of protections around the children who participate in this that don't exist. So, yeah, I would love to open it up to questions, if anyone. Yes.
I was just curious. I was just curious if there's, like, infighting and or community among the momfluencers, because, for example, during the conversation, or maybe even the introduction, something came up about sleep training, and I happened to see on Instagram a conversation the other day in which people were like, you're a horrible person. No, you're a horrible person. Basically. And so I was just curious about both, like, infighting and community.
Oh, gosh, I don't know. I mean, I think, many of the women I spoke to for the book certainly know each other and are friendly, which makes sense. Like, you talk to your peers about your work. I don't know about the infighting, though. I feel like that also happens so much in the comments, you know.
Did any of them talk about how that affected them, the sort of feedback they would get from
Yes.
followers?
Yes. So many of them, all of them really spoke about like the need for clear boundaries and like when they knew they had to sign off. And yeah, almost all of them struggled with it.
Yeah.
Because, you know, this need for authenticity and for transparency. And we want them to share enough that we know they're real, but not too much where it becomes not aspirational. So it's like a really psychologically impossible line to walk, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think about that often in my writing because people will ask me, like, oh, that's so brave for you sharing that. And I'm like, it's not literally at all. Like,
Right,
that's so curated. I'm not just barfing onto, like, as they are, you know?
Right.
It's totally produced.
Right.
And obviously there's confessional strains of all of this, but even so, it's like, there's a conscious choice about what to share and what to not.
Right.
And those boundaries, I think, you know, it sounds like they learned over time.
Totally.
And did it change for them? Did they sort of would feel comfortable sharing something, and then after, you know, experiencing it for a while, they sort of changed? Did they shift over time?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Like we all do. You know, you experience sharing something that you think is going to be innocuous enough for your own selfhood, and then it's not. And you're like, okay, I'm not going to do that again.
Right.
It didn't feel good.
Yeah, I having been covering this topic on and off for more than 10 years, that argument will never die. That it's going to be 20, 100, and we're going to be in hovercrafts, and then it'll still be people will still be fighting that battle, and it will not matter. I mean, it bums me out because I feel like that moment is especially when you're so sleep deprived, you're so vulnerable. And so just like vulnerable to judgment and feeling like you're doing the wrong thing. And so it just bums me out that that's still happening. But
I know.
Unfortunately, it will never stop happening. Other questions? Yes.
I'm curious about the audience. I know that I know what momfluencers are doing because of the jobs that I've had in marketing, advertising, publicity, and I know there's a general sort of waking up to influencer culture, and you know, the general population is starting to understand that people are monetizing or making money, but I know that some of these accounts, you just kind of fall into them, and maybe they're not really overtly selling you anything besides an ideal you think. So is the general population or the people that are following these aware of what's happening, or are they really just in that very much like aspirational, I'm not enough, I need to be that?
Right. I mean, this is an unsatisfactory answer, but I think it depends. I certainly think, especially post-pandemic, that many moms are clear on the fact that of course there is a layer of performance, and of course this is just one slice of somebody's life, and it doesn't represent the whole of someone's life. But again, these narratives, you know, they get absorbed within us, often unconsciously. And I think that's where it can be kind of tricky. Like, we can intellectually understand, like, this is not the whole thing. They have bad days, they have messes, they have tantrums. But when we're just stuck in our messiness and our grayness, and we're just seeing something that just looks so clear, I think it can be hard to hold on to that intellectual understanding of the truth.
Even knowing what's happening, I still fall into those
Totally.
things, right? So.
Totally.
More, there's one. Yes. Yes, you, yes.
Thank you so much for talking about this. Your newsletter's been so informative. I write about and research Fab Lives for graduates, so super interesting. I wanted to ask a little bit about this, like, especially amplified wave of literature about like unequal domestic labor in the past year, and like how the pandemic was like a pressure cooker for that kind of conversation. And specifically, two pieces that I've been interested in are the recent piece on postpartum depression that came out in the New Yorker, which was like a harrowing but also a really great read.
By Jessica Winter?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think a piece last year about like why aren't the momfluencers talking about abortion,
Oh, yep.
And I've been kind of interested to hear, like, do you see momfluencers potentially having the potential for political organizing or advocacy for mothers?
Yes.
In like a, I mean, I know to a certain extent rabbis do that, but like
Right.
in a sort of constructive, useful way.
Yes.
This, like, as you said, clearly massively undersupported,
Right.
not socially sort of supported institution of motherhood.
Yeah. No, 100% yes. I have a whole chapter in the book about those moms specifically, because they're out there, and you know, the algorithm obviously is tricky because if you're only following one type of momfluencer, you're just going to get fed that same type over and over. But there are so many incredible writers and content creators out there really changing the narrative. Especially you're talking about the division of labor, domestic labor. I think of Laura Danger. She's incredible. She's huge on TikTok, but she's also on Instagram, and you know, that is her whole platform. I think of Casey Davis. She's really incredible. Yeah, there's tons. Rebecca Tausig talks about her experience as a disabled mother, and many of them also partner with maternal advocacy groups. So yeah, there's a ton of energy there in terms of disrupting these ideals and drawing attention to the very real need for systemic change, which I found very encouraging.
I'm going to bum you out.
No!
Especially the piece that I have running tomorrow is about this specifically. So I make the argument, which, you know, it's just, I got a lot of opinions. You can disagree with them. I feel like there has been moving forward politically. So you see Biden saying, like, I'm going to do this executive order on childcare. Will it actually go through? I don't know. But I think it is meaningful that it is at least a stated priority. Especially, like, I found this quote from the 90s, which implied that any kind of help with childcare was just a handout to yuppies from a Republican. And nobody would say that anymore. So it feels like even though we're not quite there in terms of financing the help, like it feels like the culture is shifting there. I think the culture of work is shifting slowly. Even though you're going to read op-eds every week from management saying return to the office is necessary, and any kind of, like, when you look at the numbers of people, it was something like only 9% of New Yorkers who are office workers are in the office 5 days a week, which I was actually shocked it was that low. So that you do see more flexibility. They're doing it begrudgingly, but it's happening. Where it is glacially slow is in the division of labor. And I think part of the problem is that most of the people in this room are not men, and we are just talking about it amongst not men, and they are the ones who have to change. I talked to an economist who calculated, using the time use data that we have, that men are getting an extra month of leisure a year, and women are doing an extra month of unpaid labor.
Yeah.
And, like, I get it. I wouldn't want to give up an extra month of leisure either. Like, but we can talk about it till we are blue in the face.
Right.
And what was extra depressing was, like, even in more egalitarian societies, it's not as bad as it is here.
Right.
But it's still there. It's so sticky.
I know.
And I believe that things can move forward, but I get really bummed when I see
I do too. No, I do too. Like, I think there was a Pew where it was like 46% of Americans still think that one parent should be, in the home, and obviously that one parent is presumed to be the mom. I guess I'm hopeful, though, that there is, like, an increased vocabulary about these issues that I
think that's right.
don't think existed before. And, like, we need to be able to clearly name something and then talk about it and then move things forward. So, I don't know. I totally agree it's not moving fast enough, but I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, there was a new survey that came out recently also that said that even when women make more money, they're still doing way more housework. And that part of the reason they are doing it is because they are afraid that they are emasculating their husbands by making more money. And it's just a roughie, man. Like, it's, and I think there's I do think also the COVID opened a conversation about burnout.
Yep.
And that is ongoing. And I think there's just so many ways American mothers feel unsupported that there's numerous levers to pull to make them feel more supported. But I was depressed. And I wrote something depressing, so I'm sorry.
It's an occupational hazard.
Yeah. I'm wondering, we didn't get to it, but this great question is reminding me, the sort of rise of the very far right-wing influencer, and you talked about that free birthing lady who I'm fascinated by.
Yeah.
Yolanda
House or something.
Yeah. Talk to me about those folks and their and how it's always I actually had a burner Instagram for a while where I followed them because I didn't want to pollute my normal feed. And they were clearly all talking to each other, and it was hard for me to tell how influential they actually were. Because it was like, is the same group of people following all of these people? Right. And so it's like a closed loop of like very misinformed health information. Right. Or just tell me about those folks and what happened with them during the pandemic and how influential you think they actually might be.
I guess I'll start with a depressing little data point, which is that when I first started writing about them, they're kind of focused on in one chapter of the book. I don't know, it was like a year before I did final edits. And when I did final edits, all of their follower counts had risen. So like a year, maybe 2 had gone by and all of the follower counts had risen. So that was depressing. That being said, I do think you're right that just like we're speaking to our own echo chambers, they are to some extent speaking to theirs. But I think it's dangerous because so many mothers are systemically disenfranchised. And because so many mothers have real reasons to distrust big systems. You think of maternal health care and, it's just a mess. Yeah. So mothers have real reasons to distrust big medicine and big pharma. They have real reasons to worry about bodily autonomy. But many of these momfluencers will take those real concerns and pervert them into often gender essentialist, gets very turfy very quickly. And I think that's why they're so dangerous, because they root a lot of the ideology in real issues, but then twist it into something that becomes really harmful and it's insidious really quickly.
Yeah. I'm just like, if you want to give birth in the woods alone, I guess you can do that. But I don't know, I still can't. As like a convincing other people to do it was always where I'm just like, I don't know.
Well, and it's always so tied to you are a good mother, you are a strong mother, you are a true mother, you are a feminine mother if you do it this way.
Right.
And if you don't, you are failing in some way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so much of that in the sort of conversations around how we give birth and how, that's a real hornet's nest. More questions.
Hi. Well, I'm curious. Hi, Sarah. I'm curious about your exploration into different ethnic and racial, sort of like what momfluencers look like across racial and ethnic lines.
Yeah.
And what that discussion was like, because I feel like there's such a, when I close my eyes and think of a momfluencer, she's just like white with a long open cardigan, long hair, like boho chic.
Yeah.
And so I picture, if there's a black mom whose focus is on motherhood, on her page, she's probably talking about like, and I'm stereotyping here.
Right.
Generalizing. Talking about like black maternal health care.
Right.
And then issues dealing with race and other things.
Yep.
And that, I don't know if that's the case. So I'm just curious about like that exploration for you?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you're totally right that we close our eyes and we see a pretty white mommy in her pretty white house. And often the pretty white mommies in their pretty white homes can, claim to be apolitical because so many things happening are not directly impacting them or their children in ways that Black mothers and mothers of color, disabled mothers, and now there are marginalized mothers, they can't be apolitical. Like, that's not an option. So, yeah, I think you're right that often, mothers of color do focus or at least incorporate social justice and current events into their platforms. White moms also disproportionately earn a lot more than mothers of color. I talked to one Black mom who, she has a hair care company and does like momfluencing kind of as a side gig. But she was talking about when she was trying to get her hair care company off the ground, she was talking to like white investors. And she was like, so there's this hole in the market. We have this herbal essence product that's like the holy grail for Black women. And they were like, we don't know what you're talking about. And so they didn't see the value of it. And so she was saying that because like across all levels of this culture, there's just so few people of color like holding the purse strings. That's like a huge reason that Black moms and mothers of color and other marginalized mothers are not being paid as much. And I also think it's because the ideal of motherhood is so, especially, American mother is so apple pie white and so baked into our consciousness as white for very explicit reasons. Like, it didn't come out of nowhere.
Right.
So that was a huge, I have a chapter in the book on whiteness, and it really could have been the whole book. And it is the whole book in a way. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Thanks. Curious about the journey.
More questions? Yes.
Question about like the career experience that these women have. So like, was this like a career that they sort of fell into, or was it intentionally chosen? And to your point that they aren't earning a ton of wages, but it's skilled labor. Like, do they feel satisfied like doing all this work? Maybe inconsistent wages, no benefits. Do they have regrets, or are they really happy with what they've chosen to do?
Yeah, I think a lot of them pursue it not as a means to an end, but I want to get my photography business off the ground, and this is a great way to get my name out there. A lot of them have side gigs that they're trying to build visibility for. I would be interested. I didn't interview a ton of like Gen Z moms for the book. I'd be really interested to know 22-year-old moms now where influencing is a career and they grew up seeing it as a career. I am curious to know how many younger moms are explicitly pursuing this as a profession, and I don't really know.
I've talked to some of them. I think they get to it faster. I think it's hard to be like, oh, I'm gonna be a momfluencer because I need the baby. Like, you need to, if that's. But I think that especially if they're in a situation where working outside the home is not possible for logistical reasons, then they're like, okay, I need to make money. This is a way to do it while I can be with my children. And so I think they are getting to that point more quickly. Is again, haven't done a survey. I think we have time for one more question. Anybody? Yes.
So this is kind of a question for both of you, because I feel like both of your books, one of the things that was most interesting to me was the way that it's about how actual individual women relate to ideals, right? Ideals of motherhood generally, or ideals as represented on Instagram. And I can't remember, I know you both must know Annette LaRue, but I don't know if you mentioned her in the...
I didn't mention her, but I definitely know.
So it's this idea that there's a class divide in terms of how people think about the work of parenting, right? So middle and upper middle class parents tend to think of concerted cultivation is what this...
I did use that term.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, and then the opposite, which is more typical in working class and poor families, and these are both across race, is what you found, is called the accomplishment of natural growth, right? And so I think she's kind of arguing that there's this class difference in the way that parents conceptualize the work of parenting. Right? And so I wondered, when you were talking to all the women for your books, or parents, did you notice differences in the way people related to the ideals of parenthood, of motherhood? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think I found more sort of cultural differences rather than necessarily class differences, because I think there's a way in which the internet has flattened all of our experiences, and I think that there's also fewer people are having children. And so I think that there's more a sense of declining resources, especially for native-born Americans of all races. So I think I heard less of it, but again, it wasn't a sort of sociological survey, although I talked to a lot of moms of all across racial and class lines. What was interesting to me was sort of the uniformity of everybody knew what the ideal was. How, to the extent to which it affected them.
That's what I wanna know.
Yeah. It was different aspects. So I don't think anyone felt immune to it.
Okay.
But different things would bother them, and they were able to put things more aside. So the example I'll give is, some people get really worked up about being a working mom and never let go of the guilt of working outside the home. Women who's had working mothers themselves, and especially Black women, most of whom were raised by, at least the ones that I talked to, and I think statistically this is true more universally, almost all of whom had mothers who worked, were not bothered. They were just like, what? They just almost didn't understand like what that expectation was about. And so I think there is a way in which each of those expectations sort of hit differently depending on what your sort of background and experience were. But I didn't find almost anyone who wasn't affected at all. And I wonder if it is because the internet has just exposed all of us to a more uniform vision. I have no proof of that.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are brilliant sociologists who are looking into it now, but that was long-winded. So what would your...
Yeah. I would totally agree that like the cultural differences really showed themselves. Valerie Metz is one of the momfluencers in the book, and she is of Mexican descent, and she was saying like, I was never gonna do the all white everything home. Like that is not what I grew up with. I grew up with color. My favorite color is yellow. But she was very aware that that was the ideal that brands sort of expected her to emulate. But at the same time, she sort of found her niche as being like the antithesis to the all white everything. But yeah, I think you're right that many of these people I talked to were aware of what the ideal was, and were aware when they were rejecting the ideal or speaking against that ideal or providing an alternate viewpoint.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for everyone who asked questions, and thank you both for an excellent conversation. As I mentioned earlier, Sara will be signing my coworkers, pointing to the area where she'll be set up. We just ask that you line up along the center aisle with your personal belongings. That way my coworkers and I can start breaking down the space. But yeah, let's give these two one last round of applause.